No, I don't. Hello, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. I hope you are here to learn more about salary projections and understanding salary projections. We'll just get started. I'm Jackie Treschel. I'm with the Connect Carolina Change Management Team. In the room, I have a subject matter expert because while I can present on this, I am not all in the weeds on this. And it turns out I actually have more than one subject matter expert that I didn't know was going to be here. So Chris Lawless is in the room. She's with Connect Carolina Commitment Accounting. Crystal Jackson is or if you do anything with Pat, you probably know their names as well. Yes? Yes. Okay. Before we get started, if you attended, which is the weird thing, the webinar, if you attended the webinar in the spring, this is going to look very familiar to you. And by very, I mean it's the same presentation. It's just that in the spring, it was Anita Collins and myself presenting with Chris Lawless, and today you just get me. So a little bit about me. I've been on the Connect Carolina team for about 2.5 years now. I was an OSR for a couple of years before that. I am a Tar Heel by trade. So that's about it. So how many people in here are on the HR side of the house? Okay. How many people on the finance side? All right. And how many people on research, which I know is kind of straddles both? Okay. All right. Good to know. So we are going to talk a little bit about finance, you know, state funds and that sort of thing. And we are going to talk a little bit about contract and grant funds as well. There's more seats in the middle if you want to hop over people. All right. So let's get started. So today, again, we're going to focus on the 3 factors that are used to calculate salary projections. A quick plug for this afternoon. There is a presentation. You might see me again this afternoon at 1:15, I think it is. That's a deeper dive into this. So right now we're just covering kind of high level what's used for salary projections. And then this afternoon we'll go a little bit deeper what the formula looks like and that sort of thing. So that's 1:15, but I don't remember what rate. Yes. Yes, they will be posted on CC Info along with the recording. But I will tell you, so all of the slides from today that aren't panels will be posted on CC Info in about a week. You get the benefit of having one that's already up there. So if you wanted the slides, they're already on CC Info from when we did the webinar in the spring.
And the part 2 will be in this room.
It is in this room. Perfect. So same location, different time. All right. So let's get going. Anybody recognize this reference card? No? How many people go to CC Info? Okay. How many people have no idea what I'm talking about when I say CC Info? All right, that's good. So this reference card, a lot of the material we're covering this morning and also this afternoon comes from this reference card. So this is a not fully exhaustive, but it's a pretty good, wow, words are not my friend this morning. It's a pretty good reference for information about salary projections that explains how they're calculated. All right, so what is a salary projection? It says it up there. The big thing is it's an estimate, right? We're just trying to get an idea of the salary and fringe that an employee is going to be paid. And again, it is a projection, which means it's going forward. We're not looking at anything in the past, we're just looking forward. And so what are they used for? They help you to estimate, because they're estimates, how much money will be left on a grant or other funding source after paying employees. And you can see it on InfoPort reports. And when are they calculated? Sort of tricky thing here. They are calculated now in the system every weeknight except for holidays. So let me talk a little bit more about weeknight before I go back to that. So you see I have a July 18 Remember I said these slides were from the spring? So let's just pretend this is July 19th showing up there. Salary projections are calculated every night during the week. July 4th is a holiday, so they aren't calculated on that night. So they are calculated on Tuesday, the 3rd, and Thursday, the 5th, but not on Wednesday, the 4th. This is a little bit different than it was about a year or so ago, 2 years ago. Is that right? Wasn't it? Anyway, doesn't matter. Current state is it's every weeknight. And so what that means is, for those of you on the HR side of the house, you use a fund swap EPAR to change funding sources. Once that is fully approved and executed, the salary projections will update that night. So it's not when you submit it, it's not when you think about creating it, it has to be fully approved and executed in the system, and then that night is when the salary projection gets updated. For those of you not on the HR side of the house, anybody not HR know what an EPAR is? Yes.
Well, I can explain it.
Oh, okay. All right. It is an electronic personnel action request. So it is how we are hired at the university. It's how our funds are moved around at the university. It's how lump sum payments are done. So anything on the HR side is done with an EPAR. Any questions about that? Okay. And then after each paycheck is paid and distributed, the system recalculates the salary projection because it is now in the past, and salary projections only look forward. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. All right, so the 3 factors: employee group, funding sources, end dates. Let's talk about employee group first. So the first thing is we need to know who we're projecting for and who we're not. We do not project for all employees at the university. First one, SHRA permanent employees. EHRA faculty are projected for. EHRA non-faculty. Does everybody know the difference between SHRA and EHRA? What it stands for, not okay. And EHRA students, we do project for them. And EHRA postdocs. And EHRA clinical fellows. So now you're all sitting there and you're like, all right, that's like everybody at the university, right? No, it's not. So who don't we project for? SHRA temporary employees. So temporary, that have a classification of temporary, retirees, and SHRA students. So the reason we don't project for them is because they are paid hourly. They are paid based on the hours that they put in. And we can't, you know, if you have a student, say, that's supposed to work 20 hours, but then they have a class, and then, you know, they can't show up this day or that sort of thing. They don't have benefit time to cover that, so they may only work 10 hours. But now we've projected 20, and we've over-projected what we're going to pay. So the current state is we are not projecting for those employees. EHRA students who are on short work break. So if they are on short work break, they are not working, which means they're not getting paid, which is why we don't project for them. There's nothing to project if they are on short work break. But remember, if they are working, we're projecting for them. But if they're on short work break, and that's a formal term, right, in the system, it's short work break. And it requires an EPAR to put them on short work break. So if that's been done, we are not projecting for them. And the last one has a little asterisk by it, affiliates. Affiliates are not technically employees of the university. They get paid outside of the payroll system. So we do not project for them because projections happen within the payroll body. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about who's in and who's out, who we're projecting for and who we're not? Yes?
What is the difference between EHRA students and SHRA?
Chris, can you answer that more succinctly of why we project for?
So an EHRA student is pretty much expected to spend, say, 20 hours a week on a job. An SHRA student is, first of all, they're gonna be paid a much lower salary, but they're gonna do things like student stores or really sporadic hours. And they're not as predictable as when they're actually going to do those hours in those jobs. We have some SHRA students, they're hired as a student, but they don't get a paycheck, for a whole month because they didn't put any hours in that one. Whereas and work study, we also don't project on work studies.
So EHRA students are typically like graduate students.
And their salary.
And their salary.
Yeah.
And they're exempt, right? All right, so let's move on. So the other factor that goes into employee group is knowing which employee group they belong to. So SHRA or EHRA. So if they are subject to the State Human Resources Act, or if they are exempt from the Human Resources Act, that depends on what the fringe rate looks like for those. All right, so let's do some interactivity here. So Chandra is a part-time temporary SHRA employee at the School of Medicine. Will her salary be projected? No. All right. Christoph is an active EHRA student at the School of Dentistry. Will his salary be projected?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Those are the easy ones. I'll just warn. Okay. So recapping, employee group matters because of the fringe benefit rate, and we calculate for all employee groups except for EHRA students on short work rate and SHRA temporary employees, and affiliates don't count as employees, so we don't project for them. Any final questions on employee group? All right, let's move along. So now we're going to go to funding sources. So what is a funding source? It is the source that funds an employee's pay. And it is entered on a chart field string on the funding grid. And that is on ePARS as well. So where does the money come from? Most, I think this is all inclusive, right? These four? Mm-hmm. Okay, so all either come from state funds, F&A, which is facilities and administrative, trust funds, or project funds. So that's contracts and grants. Those are your research funds. And you could be paid by more than one source. In fact, a lot of people at the university are paid by more than one source. So you could have something that looks like this. So in this example, this person is paid 20% from state, 10% F&A, and then they have two separate projects that are paying the rest of their salary at 30 and 40%. Or you could have something that looks like this, where you have 90% state funds, 10% F&A funds, or you could have 20 different funding sources. You have somebody that works on multiple projects. Or you could have one. You could just be paid off of state funds, or a project might have all of your funds. But it matters where the funds come from when we get into how we project. All right, so let's look at another scenario here. So Ethan is a permanent SHRA employee. 55% of his salary is funded by a federal grant, and the remaining 45% is funded by F&A funds. Will both of his funding sources show up on the salary projection?
Yes.
Yes, they absolutely will. Because he is a permanent employee, we are projecting for him, and we project across all of those sources. Susan is an SHRA retiree who works part-time. 65% of her salary is funded by a research project, and the remaining 35% is funded by state funds. Will both of her funding sources show up on the salary projection? No. Why not? Because she's a temp. That's exactly right. We are not projecting for her at all. All right, so just recapping that section. Again, I know some of this is a little bit redundant in this format, and it's mostly because as a webinar, I can't see faces to know that people are getting it, so we really want to hammer it home. But here, I can look at you and see that everybody understands what I'm talking about, and we can move along. So I'm not going to read this, but the big thing is these aren't exclusive, right? We talked about employee group, and then we talked about funding sources. So you have to take both of those things into account, as well as the next one I'm going to talk about, which is end dates. So they build on each other. Yes, ma'am.
That's a quick question.
Sure.
It's sort of relevant here. If you have an EHRA person with a secondary appointment, the secondary appointments get included in the projections as well?
Secondary
Yes.
appointments secondary appointments do get included in the projection. Thank you, Chris. All right, so now let's talk about end dates. So employee group and funding sources were pretty straightforward. Yes? All right. End dates must be too, right? End dates are a little trickier. So we have 3 end dates. So first we have when the job is set to end. Then we have when the funding source is set to end, right? So technically like when the money runs out, or when we've said no more, we're not paying from that fund on there, or when the budget period ends finishes, right? So the time is what those 3 end dates are. So let's talk specifically about each of those real quick. So the first one is the job end date. So that is the last day that the person will work if the job is set to end. So those of you on the HR side of the house know that that is the day after they are supposed to finish work, right? So if they are supposed to finish work today on October 18th, they're going to work today. Their job end date will be tomorrow in the system, so October 19th, so that they can get paid for today. That job end date, when we use that for projections, it's mainly for EHRA students who aren't postdoc trainees or clinical fellows paid by stipend. We do not use job end date at all for faculty. So even if they have a job end date in the system, we do not use it. The salary projections does not look at their job end date. And it is entered or changed using the EPAR form. Remember I said everything that happens for us as employees is with the EPAR form? Same thing. Next thing, funding end date. So this is when the funding source, so the chart field strings that pay an employee, when that is set to end, that's the funding end date. It is entered on the employee's funding grid, and it is also entered or changed using an EPAR form. Budget end date. So this is the date of the last paycheck paid before the end of the state's fiscal year or the end of a budget period for a project. So if you're with contract and grant funds, it's the end of the budget period for the project. And the last paycheck date is different for monthly and biweekly employees. And the end of a project's budget period may not be the same as the day of the last day of the state's fiscal year. So does everybody know the end of fiscal year? June 30th. How about projects? Whenever the sponsor says, right? The sponsor says you can spend money till this day or this day or this day. It is not at all dependent on our state's fiscal year. Okay, so then the system calculates the projections for that time period that starts on the first day of the current pay period, right? Because we're not looking in the past, so we're looking current. And then it ends on a date that varies depending on the answer to these questions. So does the employee's job have an end date? Does the funding source have an end date? Or what type of fund is it? Seems straightforward, yes? Kind of. The big thing is that it's the earliest date, right? So if the person's job is set to end, but their funding source ends 6 months later, we're not going to keep projecting if they're not working, right? I mean, we want accurate projections is the big deal. So we use the earliest of those 3 dates. Now, specifically, let's talk about state, F&A, and trust funds. So state funds for this year, we're going to project until June 30th, 2019. That's the end of the fiscal year. So if you have a job end date 10/1/2019, we're only going to project through the end of the state fiscal year. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Let's try it. So here's whoops. All right, so here's our end dates. So April 30th, 2019, September 15th, 2019, or the budget end date of 6/30/2019. For this employee, we're assuming it's an employee that we are projecting for. What date are we going to use to project? Job end date, 4/30/2019. It's the earliest of those 3 dates. All right, let's look at one more. So in this one, the job end date is 6/30/2019. The funding end date is blank. And the budget end date is 4/15/2019. Which one are we going to use? 4/15/2019, right? So we're not going out to the job end date if the budget end date on the fund is earlier, right? So we are talking about the earliest date. Any questions for state F&A or trust funds? No? All right. So, same thing we just said. It's the earliest of those dates, but there's a little note down here. See this little note? The information does not apply to postdoc trainees and clinical fellows paid by stipend on NIH training. Okay, so we're going to put that category aside for just a minute, and we're going to talk about contract and grant funds, and then we're going to come back to these guys here. Make sense? Okay. All right, so contract and grant funding. So it doesn't make sense that we only project for the end of the fiscal year, right? The state's fiscal year, because the project funds, we just said, are not dependent on the state's fiscal year at all. So sometime early last year, this year, everything runs together now, we made a change so that project funds, we now project for contract and grant funds. We now project for up to 3 calendar years in the future. So that means if your project goes beyond the state's fiscal year, it probably does, we're not going to stop projecting based on the state information. So again, we are using the earliest of those 3 dates. So job end date, funding end date, budget end date. Which one of those on the slides? Budget end date. Yes. Yes, that is July 2019, whereas the job end date is showing at May 2020, and the funding end date is in September. Any questions on that one? No? Okay. So one more. So we have September 2019, September 2022, and September 2021.
September
19. Exactly right. We don't want to project if they're no longer working, right? It's going to mess up all of the budget information. All right, so now let's try it in pseudo reality. And remember, before I read this out, we have to build on all 3. We've got to use all 3 pieces that we used, including the 3 pieces that we just talked about. So if Marcus is an EHRA research assistant whose appointment is set to end on February 28, 2019, 100% of his salary is from a federally funded project that ends August 30th, 2019. What day does the system use to project? February 2019. And we are projecting for him because he's an EHRA research assistant. Make sense? Okay. Now we have Annie. She's an active EHRA student whose appointment is set to end on April 30th, 2019. 100% of her salary is from a federally funded project that ends September 30th, 2019. But she's only funded on the project through December 31st, 2018. What day does the system use? It's December 31, right? It is always the earliest of those days. Make sense? All right, one more, just for fun. Andre is a professor whose appointment is set to end on July 30th, 2019. 65% of his salary is from a federally funded project that ends December 31st, 2019. What day does the system use to calculate its projections?
July 30th. December 30th.
Why December 31st? Because he's a faculty member. Right. We do not use job end date for faculty members. It was a trick one. I admit it. I did it on purpose. Yes, for faculty, we do not use job end date at all. Any questions? Yes.
A question about this.
Okay.
Question. 65% of his salary is from a project that has an end date.
Mhm.
So 35% of his salary is, let's say, from the state fund.
Mhm.
Where what I'm thinking is, okay, just assume that it's gonna continue till the end of the fiscal year.
Right. So for his state funds, it would only project to the end of the fiscal year.
Okay.
For the project funds, it will go through here. Yes. So you will see different numbers. You'll see different information based on that. So you're looking at the fund source to determine how long it projects for. Yes.
Is this like kind of an argument for possibly, I know it's not always possible, but lining up appointment end dates with funding end dates, because it can get confusing?
Do one of you guys want to answer that?
I don't know, I mean,
Or it doesn't even matter.
I don't think it matters. You got the source of funds, and yeah. He's been hired for certain work, and when that end date comes up, you either renew him or he's gone.
Right. So we're just on the system side of it.
Right.
Whereas, you know, the schools and divisions are the ones deciding who's hired when and for how long and how long they're paying them, that sort of thing. Yes.
So just, I'm going to ask a really dumb question because
There are no dumb
I'm not on
questions.
the operating side of the world. I'm starting to learn that side. So in a previous career, before I came to UNC, now you've got me confused by what I'm supposed to be thinking about for salary projections. To me, I've always had an adopted budget at the beginning of the year, and you're trying to project how much of that salary you're going to end up spending in that year, and then in other words, come up with your last salary. However, some of these states are going beyond the fiscal year end.
Correct.
So what is the purpose of this salary projection, and how does it help someone in their job with trying to estimate projection for a fiscal year?
So that would be the state funds part of it. That's based on fiscal year. But the project funds, like the contract and grant funds, that's where we get beyond the fiscal year, right? So any of the state funds are not going to project beyond the end of the fiscal year. So it's the earliest of those dates. But a lot of SHRA permanent employees don't have job end dates, and they don't have funding end dates. So they only have a budget end date, which is the end of the fiscal year.
So we really are trying to get at what we're trying to estimate what we will actually spend.
Right. For those funds, it is based on the state fiscal year. Yes. But for project funds, it's different because they're not relying on the end of the fiscal year for when their project ends. Okay. Thank you.
This might be a dumb question too.
There are no dumb
Yes, there
questions.
are.
I promise there are not. What's for lunch? No. Okay.
So I do mostly project research funded. So say like a position becomes available, like someone leaves or graduates or whatever, and HR will still hold the position open so that we can incorporate that into our projections for the entire budget period. It's hard to ask this question. If the position is open and no one is in it, is it still projected? I mean, I know that's probably a dumb question.
No, it's not. It's not a dumb question, but correct me if I'm wrong, the projections are done on the payroll side of the system.
So it's based
so it's based on a person, not a position. So we are projecting for a person. So we are projecting specifically for you, not the chair next to you. Yep. No, that's a great question, actually. And I told you it wasn't a dumb question. But yes, we only project for the employees that we have. So we don't project on it. You know, if there's not somebody in that position, Connect Carolina is not projecting for that position. Any other questions? Yes.
I haven't tried or experimented with any of these projections, but they're on InfoPort, right?
They are in InfoPort.
You can run them by position, but can you also run them departmentally? All the positions within a department?
There's a salary projections report in HR, and you can run it by the person.
By the person?
Yeah, you cannot run it by the position.
Oh.
It has they're only projected for people and field positions and appointments. But it's an employee-driven report.
But can you run it? I mean, you don't have to run every single employee. You can run it in a summary.
Yes.
Okay.
You can run it by chart fields.
Okay.
by pay periods, pay begin date, pay end date. We want to put a filter on there for fiscal year so you don't have to select every single pay period you need. But that's an enhancement for the future.
Okay.
And the projections are also in several of the finance reports, like ledger roll-up and transactions. We're going to get them in the program cost code tab one day too. But, there is a salary projection report on the HR side.
On the HR side. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
So I'm going to ask a question that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. But what is the amount of projection include and exclude? So for example, some employees have overtime, and some employees may, for a certain period of time, may be working part-time.
Okay.
Base and supplemental pay.
Base and supplemental pay.
Not overtime.
Only, so not overtime. And if they are part-time, it still projects for them at their FTE. Right. Correct? Yes. So if they are part-time, they drop to, 0.5 FTE, then it's going to project for that 0.5 FTE. But yes, we are not projecting lump sum payments, overtime, anything outside of base or supplemental salary.
So if an employee is consistently working, let's say 10 hours overtime every week, this is not going to be.
It won't be in the projections. Yes.
When you look in the HR module in Connect Carolina, in Infoport, like for someone who's 0.7 FTE, the salary at the bottom of this page, if you pull up their profile page, which shows all of their funding sources. Right. Is the salary based on a 1 FTE, or is it actually based on what their actual FTE is?
I do not know.
And I don't either. And it's a different report than the topic. So,
yeah, I think it's actual.
I think at one point, I don't know why I'm thinking it, but I think at one point it was all based on 1 FTE. You had to do the percentage yourself.
I got you. And it may have changed. We've made a lot of changes in the system in the 4 years we've been live. So it may have changed. It may have been one way and changed. If you remind me after this, I'll write it down and I'll find an answer. Okay, so let's go back to those postdoc trainees and clinical fellows paid by stipend on NIH training grants, right? Job end date, budget end date. They're going to have them in the system, most likely. We are not going to look at those. We are only going to look at the funding end date, which is entered manually, right, by people in this room, to match their letter of appointment from NIH. So NIH says they have a year, right? So they have a year, typically, to be funded on that project. The project may be 5 years, but this person is only funded for 1 year on that project. We only want to project 1 year on that project. It also very often does not line up with their appointment date at the university, but they are going to be here for that year, typically. So what we do is we go in, and there's some magic behind the scenes that team has done, that doesn't look at job end date or budget end date and only looks at the funding end date for their projection. So we do project for them, but we only use the funding end date. So I doubt this will trick you, but which date are we using to project for them? Funding end date. So if all 3 of these are in the system, we're going to use 9/15/2019 as their projection date. That's the one that we're going to use. All right, so we're going to recap, and I am going to spend a little more time on this because this is sort of tricky. So the system uses those 3 dates, the job end date, funding end date, and budget end date. And it looks at the earliest of those 3 dates to project for. And the dates that are used depend on the type of employee and the type of fund that the employee is paid from. And it uses the earliest. I already said that. And so my little sticky note here, if you remember anything else, even though faculty may have it in the system, They may have a job end date. We are not looking at their job end date. So those are the 3 factors that we talked about. So a few things to keep in mind. PAT transactions, payroll accounting adjustments, are used to make historical changes, so they don't count in salary projection, right? So if you have a PAT transaction, you're changing something that's already happened, and projections are only looking forward. Lump sum payments are not included in salary projections. And for state F&A and trust funds, projections begin for the fiscal year when the next fiscal year starts. Does that make sense? Okay. And if you want the payroll calendars, you can find them at finance.unc.edu. And back to that reference card I talked about at the beginning. So all of the information I covered is written down on that card on CC Info. Yes, ma'am.
My coworkers have brought up interesting scenarios.
Okay.
Time-limited employees, how are they managed? Is it based on their
Time-limited
period?
employees, they would have a job end date, right? So it would, if their job end date is first, then it will use their job end date.
Okay, so they still even, okay.
Yep. All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Sorry.
I have sort of a PAT-related question. Not so much for grants, because I understand once the projects are closed and verified and so forth, but PATs that are done for prior fiscal years always kind of makes me wonder, like, the fiscal year is closed, you have all of your income and expenses for all your accounts, yet today we're going back to make this up fiscal year 2015 to move some stuff around. How does that even happen, like in the accounting world, or am I just so far out in Mars? Like,
It's weird, but it'll post to the current accounting period because we never go back and post to a closed period, and it will hit this year's budget, your current budget, whether you're crediting that funds or debiting funds.
so the fiscal year 2015 stays closed,
Yes.
and what I'm affecting is income and expenses, so to speak, on fiscal year 19.
Yes.
So, okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a screenshot of where you do salary projection and so forth?
I do not, actually. And I don't even think I have it in this afternoon's presentation. We talk a little bit more about it this afternoon, but we just talk about where it is. I don't have any screenshots. But if you're on the Department of Accounting,
It's HR tab, that standalone
for
salary
the
projection report is on the HR tab, and I think it's under the PAT tab. Is that right?
No.
Payroll.
Because that's the labor expense line.
Yeah. It's under the payroll.
it
tab,
is,
I'm pretty sure.
we do talk about it this afternoon.
Let's see.
You're coming back to the part 2 session. We do talk about it. And there is, in InfoPort, if you're using the InfoPort native report, there is an option to turn on and off projections when you run some of those reports. Any other questions? No? All right. Awesome. Well, we finished a little early, but if you are available this afternoon, you can come see me again at 1:15 in the same room. Over here, yes. So the afternoon, we talk about the fringe benefit rates. We talk a little bit about how cost sharing works and what the formula is that's used to calculate, like understanding what the formula looks like, and then also what the reports are that you can find in salary projection. Those slides will also be posted. Yeah, all of the slides, even if sessions don't record, all of the slides will be posted on CC. All right. Thank you, everyone. Good job.